So welcome y'all to the panel on Who is America. Sacha Baron Cohen couldn't make it, so I apologize, but we do have three awesome speakers to talk about the speech last week, Michael Anton's speech for Constitution Day. I'm gonna punish the people whose names are first alphabetically by making Kameliya Atanasova in the Department of Religion and History talk first.
Do I need to come over there? Or?
I think over there.
Over there?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Okay. So yeah, most of you here know me. I'm Kameliya Atanasova, and I'm in the Departments of Religion and History. And I teach courses on Islam and Islamic history. So conversations about Islam in the US typically focus on American Muslims' immigrant status, or else reduce to the statement that Islam is, quote unquote, a militant faith. While some Muslims are immigrants and a small number of Muslims commit violent acts, neither focus is particularly representative of the historical evidence we have. So in line with the Constitution Day theme, I want to think with you a little bit about how the history of Muslims in America is about more than just immigration. Recent Pew Research polls show that 42% of Muslims in America are US born. This isn't a recent development. Historical records show that there were Muslims in America way before the Declaration of Independence. And to illustrate this, I'd like to share two stories with you. So first one, Abdurrahman Ibrahima. Abdurrahman Ibrahima was a Muslim noble and a military leader born around 1762 in Fouta Djallon, highland region in what is now Guinea. He was ethnically Fulani, a group that in the 17th century established a Muslim state in Fouta Djallon through conquest, agriculture, and involvement in the slave trade. Coming from an elite background, Abdurrahman received Islamic education in Timbuktu and Jenne, the major centers of Muslim learning in West Africa. We now know that he learned several West African languages as well as Arabic. And he was captured on his return from a military campaign by a rival ethnic group and was eventually sold to European slave traders. As an enslaved person, Abdurrahman was taken to the West Indies, then New Orleans and Natchez, Mississippi. His attempts to explain his noble status in West Africa gained him the nickname Prince, but not his freedom in the US. Abdurrahman escaped, but then returned to Natchez, eventually marrying an African-American Baptist woman named Isabella in the 1790s, with whom he then had several children. As he was selling produce in the town market, as Abdurrahman was selling produce in the town market, John Coates Cox, a white man who had spent some time in Timbo, the capital city of the Imamate of Fouta Djallon, recognized him. Cox claimed that Abdurrahman's father had cared for him while he was ill and had provided him with guides for his return journey on the Gambia River and then home. Cox's attempts to set Abdurrahman free, however, didn't succeed. Nevertheless, he did manage to elevate Abdurrahman to the status of a local celebrity. In 1826, Abdurrahman wrote a letter in Arabic asking for his freedom. The letter was seen by a US senator, who then sent it to the US consul in Morocco. Eventually, the letter found its way to the Secretary of State at the time, Henry Clay. President John Quincy Adams intervened, offering to provide for Abdurrahman's transportation back to West Africa. Abdurrahman, however, refused to leave without his family, who were still enslaved. Mississippi locals raised the amount sufficient to free his wife. At that time, there was around $200, which is worth around $5,000 today. But lacked the money demanded for the freeing of Abdurrahman's 8 children. So Abdurrahman set out in the spring of 1828 on an East Coast tour to raise the money necessary to free his children. He met with officials, philanthropists, merchants, wealthy Christian reformers who later became abolitionists, as well as African-American civic groups such as the Black Masons of Boston. During his travels and meetings with important public figures, Abdurrahman didn't hesitate to criticize what he saw as white Christian hypocrisy in upholding slavery. His criticism was well received among a number of his benefactors, and 3 years after he had embarked on the tour, he managed to raise At the time, the sum of $3,400, which is around $90,000 in today's worth. And it was a rather impressive sum of money for the time. In February 1829, Abdurrahman and his spouse, Isabella, sailed away from Norfolk, Virginia, to Liberia. He planned on waiting for the rainy season to end before embarking on his trip to his native Timbo. He never accomplished that, unfortunately. He fell ill in Monrovia, Liberia's capital, and died in July 1829. Abdurrahman's story, despite the publicity it attracted and its bittersweet ending, is not exceptional. Estimates show that during his lifetime, at least 10 to 15% of enslaved persons in North America were Muslim. By the time of the slave trade, Islam had established a solid presence in West Africa, where a number of African slaves were captured. The story of Abdurrahman Ibrahima is one example of some of the earliest historically documented Muslim presence in the United States. Moreover, it stands well outside the context of mass immigration. From a Muslim noble, slave, fundraiser, and a local celebrity, we turn to one of the first recorded white American converts to Islam, Alexander Russell Webb. Webb was born in 1846 into a middle-class Protestant family of printers in Hudson, New York. During his childhood, he attended services at the Hudson's First Presbyterian Church, which also welcomed prominent town residents, such as one-time U.S. President Martin Van Buren. Webb questioned Christian theological doctrines, such as the Trinity, from an early age. The skepticism continued throughout his early adulthood. He moved to Chicago, but after losing a startup jewelry business in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, he left Christianity and, for a while, avoided religion altogether. 3 years after the fire, he moved to Missouri, where he worked as a journalist for a number of newspapers. During this time, Webb began exploring different forms of religiosity. He was interested in spiritualism, which sought to link the material and immaterial realms through communication with the dead. So it was a movement at the time called spiritualism. He also explored theosophy, a movement which emphasized the universal spiritual wisdom shared by all religions, but especially that found in quote-unquote Oriental traditions, such as Buddhism and Hinduism. Webb's growing interest in the mystic East, as it was called back then, led him to Islamic mysticism. And in 1886, he engaged in a lengthy correspondence with a Muslim reformer in India by the name of Ghulam Ahmed. Ahmed claimed to be a modern Muslim who wished to counter the influence of colonial Christian missionaries in South Asia. In 1887, Webb's political connections as a democratic journalist got him an appointment as the U.S. consul to the Philippines, at the time under Spanish control. During his stay in Manila, he met Muslim visitors and continued his studies on Islam. In the same year, Webb also officially converted to Islam, took the name Muhammad, engaged in further correspondence with an Indian Muslim merchant, Badruddin Kaur, and began to write English language articles on topics pertaining to Islam and Muslims for the Indian newspaper Allahabad Review. Webb's writings asked for the establishment of an Islamic mission in the US, for which he saw the support of Muslims in India. A businessman from Calcutta by the name of Haji Abdullah Arab decided to fund Webb's mission. In 1892, Webb resigned from his consular job to dedicate himself to a full-time fundraising tour in South Asia. Like Abdurrahman, that I just mentioned, Webb's chief benefactors were powerful elite members, diplomats, and merchants. He also met Muslim holy men whose blessings he received. Upon the completion of his fundraising tour, Webb returned to New York, where in 1893 he founded the American Islamic Mission, with its own Manhattan headquarters and a periodical. Webb also wrote a book entitled Islam in America. In pitching Islam to his fellow Americans, he highlighted what he saw as shared values of Islam and America, namely human equality and tolerance towards religious diversity. His activity gained him prominence, and in the same year, he was chosen as the Muslim representative to the Parliament of Religions at the Chicago's World Fair. He received a medal from the Ottoman Sultan in 1901 and lived out the rest of his life in New Jersey, pursuing another attempted American mission. Webb's mission didn't realize its intended goal. Few Americans converted under his guidance, and the mission didn't expand due to lack of financial support. Much of the promised support from his Indian benefactors never came through, and revenues from the periodical were not sufficient to maintain the mission. At least partially, his lack of success was also due to the exclusivity of his message. In seeking American converts to Islam, Webb was only interested in targeting white, educated, middle-class citizens. Webb's story is nevertheless significant as it highlights a growing shift in the American perceptions about Islam in the early 20th century. More and more American ideas of a romanticized mystic East and the spiritual knowledge it held came to include Islam and Muslims. This trend to seek Eastern spirituality and alternative religiosity in Islam, and particularly Sufism, its mystical undercurrent, continued. 3 decades after Webb's mission began, the Indian musician Inayat Khan popularized it through the establishment of the Sufi movement, called by one scholar the most influential Western Sufi group of the first half of the 20th century. American engagement with Islamic mysticism has never stopped. To date, one of the best-selling poets in the United States is the 13th century Muslim Sufi by the name of Rumi. Most of you have heard about him, who has been hailed as the poet of love by many. So I will wrap up by some final thoughts about why I selected these two individuals to talk about today. The stories of Abdul Rahman and Muhammad Alexander Russell Webb are the stories of two men, individuals in their own time and place. Precisely because they are the stories of two men, individuals dealing with their own Muslim identity in America, they also highlight that to reduce a story about Islam in America to a discussion only about immigration, or for that matter, militancy, is to ignore history. History is much more interesting. The experience of Muslims in America and of American Islam are complex, multifold, centuries-old stories. In the light of current debate around immigration and policy, it is important to remember that. Thank you.
So our second speaker is David Baluarte, who's coming to us from the School of Law, and who I think also will be able to enlighten us much more further.
So thanks so much. I want to thank the History Department for convening this conversation. It feels to me really appropriate because last week, as you all know, we had a speaker here at WNL to celebrate Constitution Day that I think takes some positions about the Constitution that are fundamentally ahistorical. And I want to take up one of those, which is Anton's position on the well-established constitutional rule that all people born in the United States are U.S. citizens, right? For those of you who were there, there was, I think, a pretty lively portion of the Q&A dedicated to sort of interrogating his ideas about what he claims is an originalist position about what the 14th Amendment actually should mean. While he claims a principled approach, it's my position that Anton's view on U.S. citizenship is actually motivated by the outcome that he would like to see, which is a much, much more restrictive rule of American citizenship and really American identity than we have in this country today. So in my remarks, I'm going to try and do two things. First, I'd like to describe why I think Anton is simply wrong as a matter of constitutional law. And I want to suggest that his reading of the 14th Amendment is fringe at best, and actually attempt to put that in originalist terms, because I think that an appropriate original interpretation of the 14th Amendment leads us exactly to where we are today. Second, I want to discuss the real impacts of inviting such fringe views into the centers of power of our constitutional democracy. And I'm going to cite a couple of current events that I think we can connect pretty directly to the fact that we have people running our government right now that would like to promote a much more restrictive rule to U.S. citizenship than that which is actually the law in our country right now. So first, to consider the 14th Amendment, right? I'm going to read the citizenship clause for you. It says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Fairly straightforward, except for one phrase in there that I think many agree is somewhat ambiguous, and that is the phrase subject to the jurisdiction thereof, right? To repeat, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are U.S. citizens. So Anton and other proponents of what is known as the consensual approach to U.S. citizenship have adopted the view that this language, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, demands that a person born in the territory has undivided allegiance to the state in which that person is born. So in this view, right, a person born in the United States subject to the jurisdiction thereof would only be a U.S. citizen if they are born to a U.S. citizen. The reasons he provides for this view, or at least the reasons he provided in his talk, were that the 14th Amendment was intended originally to guarantee citizenship to African descendants who were slaves in the United States, and two senators that he mentioned that he considered to be leaders of the legislative debate around the 14th Amendment clearly had held that position in the legislative debate. So this position, of course, is contrary to a well-settled interpretation of the 14th Amendment. The majority understanding of the phrase subject to the jurisdiction thereof is that it refers to some well-accepted, limited exceptions to jus soli nationality. When someone is born in a territory and derives the nationality of that territory, there are a couple of limited exceptions. They are if you are the child of a foreign diplomat, or if you are the child of an invading force. And there's also an unfortunate rule, in my opinion, but a rule nonetheless, that refers to the children of recognized Indian tribes. Now, historically, these were well-established exceptions, and generally the majority view is that this is exactly what subject to the jurisdiction thereof intended to refer to. So this sort of majority rule, right, was established 120 years ago by the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Wong Kim Ark. That case involved a U.S.-born child to Chinese residents who had been denied entry into the United States after being born in the United States, traveled back to China with his parents, and his parents tried to bring him back into the U.S. Now, this was a dark time in U.S. history, right? His parents were attempting to enter after the U.S. government had passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the Chinese Exclusion Act was sort of the last stop in maybe a 10-year period of increasingly restrictive legislation that was passed by the U.S. government to, at first, limit the entry of Chinese people into the United States, because the idea was there were too many of them, and then ultimately to exclude entirely all Chinese people from the United States. This went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court of the time, in the most vile and racist terms that I can possibly communicate to you right now, said, of course it's reasonable that we exclude all Chinese people from the United States. They're vermin and they're infecting the American populace. Really disgusting jurisprudence, right? The reason why I mention that is because that's the exact same court that then took up this question of whether a Chinese American kid born here could come back in from China, right? So it's not like, we're not talking about a friendly court. We're talking about a court who was openly supportive of the very sort of majority racist view of the government at that time. Nonetheless, the court looked specifically at the clause of the 14th Amendment and looked more specifically at the term subject to the jurisdiction thereof. It said, we acknowledge that this is the one ambiguous part of this clause, So let's really dig in and figure out what this means. Now, I think in the most originalist terms possible, and I think as was also very common of Supreme Court opinions of the time, there was this long, extremely boring, detailed examination of absolutely every aspect of the law that could possibly have related to this. And it really falls into three categories. There was this close examination of the English common law, right? The idea being that at that time, when we were writing law in the United States, we were very influenced by the English common law. Therefore, when we were using words and creating phrases, they were very much related to the way that those terms were understood under the English common law. Under the English common law, it was clear that there were just these limited exceptions to jus soli nationality. The court then looked at the history of US law in detail, looking back at what every judge or justice had ever said about the Citizenship Clause, looking at what members of the executive department, both the federal executive and state executives, had said about this rule, and concluded that there was no question that it established the clear rule that those born in the United States, with limited exceptions, were US citizens. And then, this is my favorite, the Supreme Court looked at the legislative deliberations around the 14th Amendment, and it didn't just credit the words of two senators that Anton apparently agrees with, but it actually looked at the entire legislative debate and said that it quite clearly was able to draw the same conclusion, consistent with the English common law, consistent with the way that every US court and executive authority had thus far interpreted this term, that indeed all people born in the United States are US citizens with some limited exceptions. So this is why I really want to highlight this idea that I think that a suggestion that, that this consensual approach to the 14th Amendment is both ahistorical and not really originalist. I think that the approach of the US Supreme Court at the time was originalist and very detailed in its approach. And I think that it settled on the right rule of law, and that's the rule of law that for the past 120 years we've had here in the United States. So perhaps you're listening to me and you're thinking, what does it really matter? Right? You have this one person talking about these fringe views that clearly are never going to become the majority view, and I don't think we're going to see an amendment to the Constitution or any legislation that really challenges this fundamental constitutional rule. And I think you're right. I think you're right. That's not going to change. But I also think it's a problem that the president and his closest advisors espouse a view like this, that we should actually reimagine the Constitution to have an exclusive rule of citizenship. And I want to draw your attention to two events recently that have come out in the news that I believe are symptomatic, if you will, of an executive that has this restrictive view of citizenship. The first was reported in the Washington Post on August 30th. This article highlighted a trend in which the State Department is now denying passport renewals to people born on the US-Mexican border because they were born to midwives. And the claim is that some of these midwives had given US birth certificates to people who were actually born in Mexico. When the evidence tells us that while this likely happened in a couple of cases, it was by no means a widespread practice. But what you're seeing right now is this sort of policy enacted under the radar, because all attempts to get information have failed thus far, but where the Washington Post article itself had interviews with people who had had their passports denied, who were clearly American citizens, who had clearly lived here their entire life. One of them served in the military, felt very much a part of this country, and was basically being told by the State Department, no, you no longer belong. I think it's incredibly troubling that this trend is picking up, And I think it's even more troubling that we're having really trouble getting to the bottom of what's actually happening. The State Department is sort of somewhere between silent and obstructionist in trying to figure out what is actually happening with these people who are having their passports denied. And I think it's pretty clear, right? While this isn't a reinterpretation of the 14th Amendment, it's certainly informed by this idea that we should have a more restrictive rule of citizenship. Also reported recently is a push by the government to denaturalize people who previously acquired US citizenship. So this doesn't involve the rule of jus soli, birthright citizenship, but I think it's related, and I think it's important to mention in the context of this conversation. Under Operation Janus, the Department of Homeland Security identified a few years back 315,000 cases in which the fingerprint data was missing from the digital repository, right, of all those people who had naturalized. And so they got concerned, and this was under the Obama administration. As a result, the administration concluded that some people may have circumvented background checks going through the naturalization process. So it looked at this problem, it considered sort of the actual risk and the resources that would be required to open up 300,000 investigations. Ultimately, it made the decision not to invest the government resources in investigating all of these cases. Recently, however, USCIS has announced Operation Second Look, and that it is referring to prosecution approximately 1,600 cases of people that it is now going to allege have acquired their US citizenship through some means of fraud. A lot of people have been waiting to see what actually is going to happen with this. The first prosecution was recently announced. I found some news in the Miami Herald. This is a grandmother in Miami, has been brought into civil denaturalization proceedings because she did not disclose her minor role in a financial crime in her naturalization application. She immigrated legally, suffers from kidney disease, is here with family, cooperated with the FBI in the investigation and prosecution of the crime. Still, now she's being pulled into denaturalization proceedings and faces deportation. Again, not exactly on point with this question of the well-settled constitutional rule, those who are born here are US citizens, but I think is really evidence of how this administration is weaponizing citizenship and trying to implement a much more restrictive idea of US citizenship than we have had to date. And I think we should all be concerned. Thank you.
Mohamed Kamara in the departments of Romance Language and the program in African Studies.
Thank you. So from that introduction, I'm sure you figured out I'm not an expert in constitutional law. I was trained in reading and talking about literature. Unfortunately, the Constitution is not a literary text.
Come on.
Nor am I a specialist in Islam, even though I'm a Muslim. So fortunately, we have two people here to back me up, and they have done their job very well. Thank you very much. So unlike other people who claim to know Islam so well as to make blanket statements about Islam, I am not here to defend Islam or to convince you that Islam is a religion of peace. I can quote countless verses from the Quran encouraging love and peace or violence. Islam, or any religion worth its name, doesn't need defending. It teaches what it teaches, and we follow what we follow. Anton's stance on the Constitution, more specifically on birthright citizenship, on immigration and Islam are all inevitably intertwined. We cannot appreciate one without understanding the other two. I refer to them as the Antonian tricephalos. So I'll look at these three components briefly from my limited understanding of all three of them. And of course, I'm an immigrant and a proud American citizen. Every country has the right to make its own laws and to enforce them. Laws don't make themselves. They are made by and for people. And we all know some laws are made specifically to favor or to disadvantage some people. At some point in the history of the West, slavery was the law of the most powerful and civilized nations on earth. It took, among other atrocities, a civil war that cost over 700,000 lives and large-scale destruction for a large swath of the American populace to accept, at least on paper, that all men are created equal. If laws can be created to oppress people, they can be rectified or amended to protect them. In the same vein, and depending on who holds the reins of power at any given time, good laws can be amended to punish specific groups within the polity or outside of it. It is the responsibility of any people to defend its constitution and its laws. Yet, because the human being is more important than the laws they create, the protection of human dignity and freedoms take precedence over everything else. If the NAACP, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and all those who fought and are still fighting for racial justice had decided that the laws of America were sacred and should be left alone, blacks will still not be citizens of this country. A just law, wrote Martin Luther King Jr., is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law, end of quote. Therefore, he continued, I can urge men to obey the 1954 decision of the Supreme Court because it is a morally right law, and I can urge them to disobey segregation ordinances because they are morally wrong. All this is a way of saying our constitutions and laws, like our religious texts, are indelibly imprinted with our humanness. To say they are closed to interpretation or abuse is to say that humans are completely divine and incorruptible. If constitutions were natural to humans or wholly divine, we would not need to invent them. In its 1994 piece, The Coming Anarchy, How Scarcity, Crime, Overpopulation, Tribalism, and Disease are rapidly destroying the social fabric of our planet, which was considered a must-read. In fact, it is reported that Clinton recommended it for his White House staff and for those who were traveling to Africa. Robert Kaplan posits, and I quote, West Africa is becoming the symbol of worldwide demographic, environmental, and societal stress, in which criminal anarchy emerges as the real strategic danger. Disease, overpopulation, unprovoked crime, scarcity of resources, refugee migrations, the increasing erosion of nation states and international borders, and the empowerment of private armies, security firms, and international drug cartels are now mostly tellingly demonstrated through a West African prism. West Africa provides an appropriate introduction to the issues, often extremely unpleasant to discuss, that will soon confront our civilization. To remap the political earth the way it will be a few decades hence As I intend to do in this article, I find I must begin with West Africa, end of quote. Michael Anton operates in the same realm as Robert Kaplan and all those purveyors of the ideology of the clash of civilizations. The perennial us versus them paradigm, the belief that whatever bad things happen to us comes from somewhere else, from someone else. As a character in a song by French rapper Abd al-Malik says, "C'est pas moi, c'est les autres." It's not me, it's the others. That Rome fell because many men who never knew republican life and did not care for it became Roman citizens. This is taken from one of Anton's articles. He's quoting someone else. The problem is always the others, not us. We are perfect because we have been primed and ordained for goodness by virtue of our race and upbringing. No wonder, therefore, that Anton decries what he calls, and I quote, the ceaseless importation of third world foreigners with no tradition of taste for or experience in liberty means that the electorate grows more left, more democratic, less Republican, and less traditionally American with every cycle. This, he says, is causing a tidal wave of dysfunction, immorality, and corruption that has America headed off a cliff. The problem for Anton is not immigration per se. It is rather the immigration of a certain group of people, namely Muslims and those from the third world. This is why some of Anton's major writings directly or indirectly mention Islam and the third world at the same time, and this is no more evident than in his 2016 piece Toward a Sensible, Coherent Trumpism, where in the same breath he denounces diversity and Islam. And the quote is, "Diversity is not our strength, it is a source of weakness, tension, and disunion. America is not a nation of immigrants. We are originally a nation of settlers who later chose to admit immigrants. Islam is not a religion of peace. It is a militant faith that exalts conversion by the sword and inspires thousands to acts of terror and millions more to support and sympathize with terror," end of quote. This brings us inexorably to the question of Islam, if you permit me a couple more minutes. I've been a Muslim for as long as I can remember. I saw the practice of Islam in my house, in my neighborhood, and in my country before I began deliberately studying my faith. Not once did my Muslim mother tell me that Muslims or Islam were better than non-Muslims or other faith traditions. I feel deeply blessed that my parents were open-minded enough to send me to Christian schools all my life when they could have sent me to Islamic schools. As Kwame Anthony Appiah, who will be here this Thursday, wrote, and I quote, "No Muslim essence stops the inhabitants of Dar es-Salaam from taking up anything from Western civilization, including Christianity or democracy. No Western essence is there to stop a New Yorker of any ancestry from taking up Islam," end of quote. There is indeed widespread fear of Islamic domination. I cannot dismiss as simply illegitimate or irrational. I will note only that there is no such thing as Muslim civilization, just as there is no such thing as Western civilization, fixed and immutable. A golden nugget, to quote Antonia Appiah's phrase, bequeathed from one generation to another. The only thing that unifies Muslims around the world is the declaration of faith, the Shahada, that God, there's only one and Muhammad is a messenger. And note, for example, that Senegal, a predominantly Muslim country, about 95% of the population of Senegal is Muslim, had a Catholic president for 20 years, a man who continues to be the most beloved and respected Senegalese. Senghor came to power in Senegal in 1960, the same year Kennedy was running for president, and he was facing headwinds because of his Catholicism. It is not because Senegalese thought Senghor was better than his Muslim opponents, that because he was a Christian, a Frenchified black African, he was elected all those many times against Muslim opponents and still respected today because Senegalese, even in belonging to this terrible religion called Islam, have had the ability to look past their religious appurtenance to respect a man who respected them first. It is true that there are Muslims who would like to take over the world and remake it in their own image. Of course, absolutely. Such groups as Al-Qaeda and ISIS have made no secret of their objective. But in this, they are no different from Hitler, for example, who sought to conquer the entire world under the swastika of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, named the Nazi Party. Western civilization couldn't prevent the rise of the Nazi Party or the Holocaust. Hitler didn't need Islam or the Third World to cause damage. The greatest atrocities against humankind have been perpetrated in the defense of some civilization or religion. Religion is not so much about the text as it is about the people. In this sense, religion can be hijacked by politics. Whether we live in a theocracy or in a democracy where religious nationalisms can hold sway over many. Thank you.
So we wanted to make sure there was plenty of time for questions from our panelists, but also I think to think more generally about sort of the fact that Anton was invited to give a very prominent annual lecture. Someone, as our speakers have said, is fringe, ahistorical, and also, right, sort of if insofar as the universities are generally, right, sort of we hope committed to rigorous intellectual inquiry, and right, sort of WNL has this sort of professed commitment to diversity. What is the sort of kind of degree, how should we think about the invitation that was he took up to come here and give a lecture on Constitution Day? So I'll open up to the audience.
So I'm from the politics department. My department's name was put on the invitation, unfortunately. But what I would note about that is that it strikes me that there's, in my department, and maybe generally university-wide, there's not sometimes a very clear process for these things. So it was possible for this invitation to be made, and I don't know how much money to be spent, but I'm assuming a good bit amount of money, without a wider reflection on whether the speaker in any way reflected just fundamental intellectual qualities we would expect out of our students in our classrooms. And so I think there tends to be that problem sometimes at WNL, that we are not exacting enough about our intellectual standards. I'll never go on sabbatical again. No.
That's the answer to everything,
Yeah,
Robin.
that's not it. But I do think that's something for us to all think about ways in which we can make clear at least fundamental intellectual standards. I think dialogue with people who have differences of opinion is great, but many of the passages you quoted were passages from this Flight 93 election essay, which as a work that a political science department should have supported is abhorrent, because they're terminologies and descriptions of events that just wouldn't hold water in a normal political science conversation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, I wanted to start by thanking the three of you. I thought it was just a magnificent panel, and I learned so much, and the views were so varied and so informed, and I'm very grateful for the panel. And as Sarah pointed out, I'm trying to reflect on the whole phenomenon of this week, and a faculty invited speaker who was provocative, and had a range of views, and a superb intellectual and I think artistic and legal and theological panel that also had such an array of views. And of course, this panel was occasioned by that speaker who came to campus. And I'm trying to put all that together and think about responsibilities of the university to be occasions for critique and imaginative engagement and debate. And I so wish that all the students who were at the Constitution Day talk last week were here today. And I'm thinking about, how can we as a university enhance these sorts of engagements? So instead of a talk and then a panel, we can somehow bring these things together into enhanced discussions and debates. And I'm just wondering, as the three of you thought about your remarks today, I imagine you're not only thinking about the content of your remarks, but the context of this event. And I'd just be curious what your reflections are and what you thought about this week and the great work you were engaged with.
I'll answer. Thank you, Mark. I really I appreciate the comments, and I appreciate sort of the broad view, right? Because I think that is absolutely true, that it's sort of Anton coming here that prompted this conversation, and I think this is a really valuable one to have. I found it a little bit difficult in preparing my remarks because I didn't want it to be, I know it's a response event, but I didn't want it to be so focused on Anton. I have to admit to being a little bit upset though. I think that I'm right now as an immigrant rights lawyer living and working in the United States, I feel like I'm constantly being assaulted. And my clients are constantly being insulted. I'm just like, we exchanged emails, right? I feel like half of the committee meetings, I'm missing them because I'm up in immigration court. And they're just coming at us so hard. And so it's tough. It's tough, I think, for me right now to separate the emotion, right, from a proper sort of constitutional law critique of what I think is a ludicrous idea. I hope that I managed to achieve that, but that was one of the challenges that I faced.
Yeah, a comment from the student.
Well, I totally agree. I think we should definitely hold more events to have that debate, to engage civically. I think it's a little bit hypocritical to have held an alternate event during the same time as Mr. Anton's speech. It would have been WNL-esque to engage civically, to go down there asking those questions and not protest. I don't want to use that word, but sit upstairs and talk about how horrible it was that somebody with different ideas, diverse ideas, came to WNL. And it's sad, I'm not at all convinced that this would have been any different had it been another Trump administration official.
I think I saw Tim and then Melina.
I was going to return to the question of whether this is just a diverse opinion or whether it's the opinion of someone who really is setting a very low bar for, you can even invite someone to make the argument that the birthright citizenship is unwise for one reason or another. But to invite someone basically just on the basis of their celebrity status to make arguments that really don't hold water, that wouldn't even, that would get a low grade as an undergraduate paper, which is the point I think that Baluarte was making. And to make this a high-profile event and have that be the event where everybody comes precisely because it's a high-profile event, right? I mean, one of the sad things is that many more students were at that event than are here, by the nature of the thing. Right? That was the event. This is the response. He was the outside invited speaker for Trump advisor, and this is an in-house, reflection on what just happened. And at this very moment, too, right after this event, originally on my phone, it says that I was supposed to go hear a musical event in Lenfest, which has been canceled because the Indian performers who couldn't get visas, pitching themselves as gypsies. Of course, they're only gypsies in a very loose sense. But I'm reminded then of the congressional debates for the preceding the passage of the 14th Amendment, where gypsies, along with Chinese, were singled out as the reason why we can't let all these people in. So I'm just saying that it's dismaying for the university to invite someone to represent that opinion who does it in such a low quality and bomb-throwing way. And you could get someone else to make an argument that we ought to repeal the 14th Amendment, but to bring someone in who creates a fantasy that it was never intended to say what it actually plainly does say, and uses such fatuous arguments and dismissive or selective, cherry-picked argumentation doesn't do us a service. I think it reflects badly on the university that we're holding him up. I mean, you could find someone else who could have done that, who could have represented the con opinion, right, in a more intelligent way. It would have made us look better.
Yeah, Professor Bell.
I was essentially going to say everything that Professor Ligon just said. So I just want to echo those sentiments, right, about when we're trying to engage in diversity of ideas, we should have ideas that are similar in quality, right? Not ideas that are very low quality, academically creditable ideas. But also, I wanted to correct the misconception that those of us who were upstairs complaining about the speaker. We were not. We were reading the Constitution and celebrating the Constitution. And if we can have a diversity of ideas about academic arguments or non-academic arguments, we can certainly have a diversity of events celebrating the Constitution.
Yeah, Professor Brock.
I just kind of wanted to piggyback off that a little bit, and it's actually, and then to follow up to the question. I mean, Anton was not mentioned upstairs. It really was a reading of the Constitution. I think, and also we all knew the live stream was on that we could watch. I think the desire was to create an alternative space for students who might feel genuinely assaulted and under threat by someone coming to campus who says overtly Islamophobic things. But this is a campus where there are DACA students. We've just undergone this summer where there was the terrible family separation policies. And those of us who were involved in conversations talked about if it had been a Trump official who did not have some radical fringe view, but actually, sort of represented the sort of goals of Trumpism, or at least was a sort of thoughtful preservative, that would have been no problem. But in the same way that if we were having an annual lecture on climate science, it would not be intellectually sustainable or tenable or defensible to invite the one guy who doesn't believe in climate change versus the 300 scientists who do, right? Content diversity, I think, is often an excuse to give voice to those ideas that are fringe and again have no real intellectual place. So I would actually really love to hear from the speakers about how y'all think we ought to deal with fringe views and when it's appropriate to engage them as if they are sort of valid modes of political thought or really thinking about theology or so forth, or when we dismiss them, how we deal with that question of content diversity on a college campus and what true content diversity might look like versus sort of artificial or intellectually superficial content diversity.
So to start with, my position has always been fundamentally people have their rights, the right to their opinion, and we should not make it our responsibility, whether as an individual or as a group or as a state, to even try to squash those opinions. And while we may not create, a big megaphone deliberately, if you will, out of our own resources to allow that person to express their opinions, we must not block them from expressing their opinions. And so Michael Anton's views are his views, and he may strongly believe in those views. And we just hope, and we've just had this opportunity a week after to organize this conversation, to react in a way to his presentation, but not so much to his presentation as to his views, even before coming to Washington and Lee. And so I, for one, am grateful for that opportunity. When I was approached to be a part of this, I was thinking of it not so much from the perspective of a response directly to what he said, but I had read some of his writings before he was invited, and I had my own thoughts about those, so this gave me the opportunity to do that. So in that sense, his coming here produced something positive, I hope, of sorts, because now we are talking about what we are talking about. So generally speaking, that's, I would not invite him here, but at the same time, I will not, picket fences. I will not go stand there and say, you have no right to be here. And the people who invited him knew what they were doing, and they did invite him, and this is where we are. But fundamentally, he has the right to express his views, and he has the podium to do that, whether we agree with him or not.
I would say that he has the right to his views, but he doesn't have the right to the truth, right? Which I think sort of many of you are objecting to. And also, as Professor LeBlanc was pointing out, how many of you have read the Flight 93 election? So as far as I can figure out, it's the argument that trans people want to go to the bathroom in safety, and so we need to shut down the borders. Which, right, like, so, I'm not a political science professor, but if I were one, that would be a hard argument for me to imagine, right, without a lot of sort of much more explanation than he provided, buying it. And so I do think there is a way in which sort of, universities were places of careful deliberations. We also do need to stand up for the truth. And we all know that, right, sort of this is an era in which the truth is, needs its defenders, unfortunately.
Can I also respond to what Mickey asked? So I kind of want to bring that back to the classroom and the conversation about what we do on campus. And I mean, I guess one way of the way that I think about what I'm doing here is that my mission is not to teach students what to think. I think what I'm here to do is perhaps teach students how to think, right? And that means that the conclusions are, up for whoever is making those conclusions. And so when we're talking about different opinions, like that's kind of like how I operate. Is we can present those different opinions because I think there's multiple truths. And when I teach about Islam, I never say that Islam is this or the other. It's, if anything, I try to emphasize there are multiple Islams, so there are many Islams. And the emphasis here is again on the interpretation of the sources with which people engage. And so there will be a difference of opinion. I think it's important to point to that, of course, and to kind of create that sort of opportunity for you students to also work as historians and to look at the different materials and to decide for yourself like how you want to interpret what is going on or what was happening in the past and what is happening now.
And I just want to say briefly, sorry, I can imagine a fantastic panel where people debate the 14th Amendment and different perspectives on it and different views on the history that inform that. I would love to organize / go to, maybe even speak on that panel. That would be great. I think my issue is just that on Constitution Day, we had someone speaking about an idea that was constitutional, and in a way that was really upsetting to me. So I've already said that. Now I've said it twice. I won't say it again.
Yeah. I want to bring another political science point to bear here. Institutions value what they spend money on. And to the extent that university resources are used on this sort of a speaker with this level of intellectuality, which I think many of us who have actually perused the ideas would argue is extremely low, then what we did is we said, this is what we value. And those views get prominence in the United States when people pay for them. People like that can make money, can get by, can eat, can continue to do that work if we pay them. And we're not just a place where people can come say crazy things. In fact, it's hard for students to get in here. It's hard for faculty to get work here. The notion is that we're operate at a higher level. And on top of that, we actually claim that we're a place that values a certain notion of civility. And civility isn't just any opinion. We wouldn't include Hitler in civility, for example. It's not the exchange of just any idea. And we're a place that tries to educate to character, we say. And as dubious as that claim might be to make, once we've made it, I think it's really important to ask how we spend our money. And just to be bald about that. And that's just on the table here.
Just in terms of information and how these invitations get proffered, I think it's important to note every institution that receives federal financial aid is legally obligated to do some kind of Constitution Day commemoration. So that's why we've had a Constitution Day event. And the tradition has long been that what we do at WNL is we do a speaker. Some places hand out pocket constitutions, others do panels, whatever. So we've done speakers for many years. And our practice is the politics department notifies the provost for who the speaker is going to be. And 2 years ago, we had William Allen, Daniel Allen's father. Last year, it was Ty Sigely giving his excoriating talk about Lee and the Lost Cause. And this year, the politics department last year told me that this was the person whom they'd selected.
But
So that is just the selection process. And I get an email from the politics department chair, and then we proceed with that. So it is not, unlike baccalaureate or convocation or Founders Day, it is not a university-selected speaker. It comes from some group of faculty. It's a faculty-invited speaker. That's all I know about how that process occurred. But I think it's important to note that I think there are speakers like Founders Day or baccalaureate where the university, meaning primarily the president, is saying this person evokes something that we stand for. All of the other speakers that are invited on our campus come from faculty and staff invitations. They don't speak for the university. They don't necessarily evoke values that we hold. And they very likely don't even speak things with which the person who invited them necessarily agrees. I think the assumption is somebody decided this is a perspective that is valuable to be heard. I think that's a debatable judgment in all cases. Was this? Why was it? Et cetera. And again, that's why I'm so thankful for this panel. It's helped me think about that in increasingly thick ways. But that, just factually, that's the status of this invitation.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I do agree with all of the professors and faculty members here that Anton's arguments were definitely not intellectually stimulating. However, I wouldn't say it was wrong to invite a speaker of that sort, because where I come from, I'm from Pakistan, and I've often seen in my experience that, populist politics is all about arguments that might not stand on a college campus, but they still appeal to people for some reason or the other. And if we students are to go out into the real world and try and make a difference, then we will have to convince people who are not on a college campus to maybe rethink their views. And so, for me, it was, even though I'm a Muslim, even though I'm an international student, it was perfectly all right. And I'd even say it was spicy to hear from Anton and then come to this panel and hear the responses of people. And I'd be okay with hearing more of the same in the future. In fact, and this might be something a bit personal, one of my seniors in high school, who was also my debates coach, he passed away last night. And he once told me a story about how on the Harvard campus they created something called the Anti-Free Speech Society, just for this very purpose, to try and see how radical views can get, and what to do and how to challenge them with civility. So I'd applaud the university for taking this initiative.
I think I saw your hand up. No?
Who, me?
Yeah.
Oh, I was just somewhat facetiously going to say, if they wanted to bring in someone on this particular topic, 18th Amendment, they might have chosen, 14th Amendment, sorry. They might have chosen the Trump judicial appointee, James who actually would have given the standard understanding and intent.
Professor Ross? Offer a comment, and again, I'd love to know what y'all think. You know, I'm not in favor of deplatforming people. I think it's a really important point. I mean, we can have a conversation about whether or not it should have been the Constitution Day lecture, which I clearly don't think this was appropriate for that. But I do think, you know, it is okay sometimes to have these very fringe views on campuses. But I think to do so in a way where there's a purposeful response and university sponsored. And I'd really like to point out that, I mean, this is something that mostly Sarah and slightly a little tag team with Molly and I organized and invited folks. And this is, y'all are not getting paid for your time. This is additional. And I think we really, I know. That's cider.
I don't know what Anton got, but I know that we spent like $46
this
particular event.
But so it's actually worth thinking about how can universities, because I think, you know, what the students have said is really important about the need to foster speech and what Provost Connor said. I mean, I think that that's really crucial. But, you know, which event has, if not, even though not an official university event, that's sort of imprimatur, even if it's not an official one, and which one doesn't, you know, where do the students show up? And so thinking about moving forward, how if we do have speakers on either side, left, right, whatever, who might be either fringe or particularly provocative or troubling for students, to sort of, you know, sustain these types of conversations in a way where we're encouraging, it's not just sort of a faculty initiative, but something that, you know, that, I mean, because y'all are putting your time into this. I wish I was giving you some money for putting Anton's spot, but I don't know what y'all think about how that's done. And other universities, how you feel about that sort of imbalance of the sort of power behind different events? And I don't know if y'all have any thoughts.
That's an interesting point. Remember a couple of years ago, was it a couple of years ago, what is his name, Juicy? No, he's a musician. Juicy J was invited on campus, and there was opposition to that invitation. And my position was, you know, if he was invited, what event was it? Was it the fancy dress, I think, or something like that?
The student event.
Oh, the student event. So and this question reminds me of that, because my position was, I have no problem with him coming, but it would be great if an environment were created where there will be an exchange, where there will be a real debate, right? Where it will not only, you know, having him throwing his lyrics out there without response, I mean verbal response, because it was a one-way performance, right? So inviting somebody that we might disagree with, but doing so in such a way as to create an opportunity to have that exchange, that's real debate, probably could be one way, if you will, you know, respecting the rights of other people to express their opinion, but also giving opportunity to those people who otherwise will not have the opportunity to have access to the mic that person, no matter how obnoxious the ideas may be, might have to the mic. Because usually it's the case, usually the loudest people are those people who don't necessarily have good intentions in terms of their views. So how do we level the ground or create an environment where it is possible for many people, the maximum number of people, to express their views and counter views?
Yes.
Yeah, I totally agree. I wish we had more students here. I wish we had, you know, more student participation in these debates. I think there should be, you know, equal platforms for one side to talk to another, and I think that's so stereotypically W&L. I mean, it's people coming together to talk on a level playing field, and, you know, it disheartens me that people aren't here, and I wish they were. I mean, the Michael Anton, it was packed. You know, people, the professors invited their students to come, and, you know, they did. I wish this had been publicized a little bit more, because I think more students would have come. And I wanted to clarify a little bit what I said earlier. You guys brought up a lot of good points. Maybe we could have brought somebody else from the Trump administration to share these views, perhaps to be a little bit more politically correct. And I said, I don't take it at face value that you'd say that. Well, last year, Parents Weekend, we invited Anthony Scaramucci to come. It sold out. Students loved it. Everybody who attended had great things to say. And the chair of the history department came to the committee and shared how horrible it was that we invited somebody who wasn't prolific enough, who wasn't good enough. Why did we have to pick him through the Trump administration? And I spoke with President Dudley about it afterwards, and he was very disappointed that a professor would say that. It's a student-run organization. We filled up the chapel. I just don't take it at face value that we'd like somebody from the other side to come, but not this person or not this person. You know, I want to believe you, but just the way that I've seen faculty on campus act in regards to student opinion and who students want to bring, that says otherwise.
I would like the chance to defend my honor, please. I was invited to talk to Contact after it became known that I had some concerns about inviting Anthony Scaramucci. You were very nice. I expressed my views. I thought we left it at that. I certainly haven't been hearing a grudge for a year.
Oh, sure. Well, it's just very relevant. Just want to bring that up.
Okay.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think that I can only talk about my personal views. I thought it was hilarious, the Scaramucci invitation. And largely because, I study scandal, so I love just like a show, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that I actually think it's very valuable to have people from the Trump administration come and talk because, I think that it does, particularly in this kind of lecture series, which is Conversations in the Era of Trump. I think my concern was more that it was Constitution Day, and so had this kind of official stamp of, this is something that, this is a kind of big name, big deal. And I don't know if other people share that concern or have a list of Trump appointees that they'd like to invite.
Maybe someone who knows something about the Constitution or Constitution?
That would be an option, yeah.
I think it would have been interesting, even someone like Sam Harris, who I think holds views on Islam that are really troubling, and I think also he misunderstands the way religion operates, the way theology operates. But he's someone who has sort of a vigorous intellectual platform, even if people find his views distasteful, just in terms of thinking about, again, the need to invite folks who can sort of speak on an even playing field. I think in terms of thinking about things like Constitution Day. So it's sort of, it's a good question. I mean, can y'all think of, sort of vigorous opponents of attitudes or negative attitudes towards Islam who are genuine intellectuals, and David, you've already named some folks who maybe would make an argument against the Constitution or the 14th Amendment or the repeal of it or whatever that would be intellectually tenable. I think that's sort of underpinning some of this.
I think it's a really good point. I guess, and maybe in this, I'm sort of betraying the fact that I'm a lawyer from the law, but yeah, I would have there are a bunch of people in the Justice Department, and I disagree with a lot of them, and they have a very different idea about how we are supposed to be sort of administering justice in the United States, and I'd be more than happy to hear from them, absolutely. I would love to have a response and say why they're wrong, but but that would seem to me a little bit more true to the idea of someone who is sort of sworn to uphold the Constitution, talking about the Constitution. Interesting idea.
Any last thoughts? All right, let's thank our panelists.